Allow me to begin this lecture with a short anecdote. Let's suppose that my friend and I are walking through a forest, and my foot hits a stone. Now, if I ask my friend, how did the stone get there? He might tell me that it's probably been there forever, and both of us would just keep on walking. Now, let's suppose that my foot instead hits a watch. Well, if I ask my friend, how did the watch get there? He might give me the same answer, but to most people that would be unacceptable, because there are many more questions that you would ask about a watch. Like, what is it made of? Or what kind of watch is it? Or simply, who made it and why? In 1802, English philosopher William Paley wrote a book that begins with this anecdote, but doesn't ask all of these questions. Instead, he only asks those of them that serve his argument. Now, Paley was a clergyman, so his book was called Natural Theology, and he used this anecdote to introduce his rather one-sided idea that when there is a design, there must be a designer. Being a member of the church, of course, he tells us that there must be a God that designed the stone, just like there was a person who designed the watch. But being as far from a clergyman as you could possibly imagine, my reason for opening this lecture with a reference to William Paley is, of course, quite different. As simple as his anecdote sounds, it prompts a number of questions that are important in terms of understanding the role that scientific development plays in human history. And here I'm talking about all kinds of aspects that have to do with the relationship between the social world and the scientific one, including the assumptions that physicists, doctors, or even linguists might generally make. The scientific inventions and the way that they change daily life, as well as the way that these two aspects intertwine with social forces and structures. So the topic of my lecture today is From Scientific Inventions to Social Evolution. And the subtitle indicates that I'll be theorizing STEM as a root cause of fluctuations in world history. It is important to note that I use STEM in this case as an umbrella concept for scientific development at large. Of course, making the deterministic proposition that natural science completely predefines the development of the social world would be rather extreme, and it would rightly attract a number of criticisms from social scientists. So it is important to hedge my argument before I start, and to emphasize the importance of doing so and the nuance of my proposition. In a nutshell, what I'll argue is not that world history is completely predetermined by STEM, but that its potential development is delimited by the possible options offered to us through the scientific inventions that we can access, and through our understanding of the natural world at large. So, in other words, this means that STEM is a force which can shape or reshape the development of our social structures, because natural sciences are in fact deeply interconnected with social sciences. Hopefully my argument will become clearer as we move on. The rest of the lecture is organized in two parts. The first one is theoretical, and it covers some basic concepts from the perspective of philosophy of science. More specifically, what I'll explain to you is why was it that 220 years ago it was acceptable for Paley to make his argument about God and natural design, but today hardly any scientists would take it seriously. So in this part, we'll establish that the development of the scientific world and the development of the social world are interlinked. Now, the second part of the lecture is empirical, and it will explain how certain scientific inventions allowed subsequent developments in social structures to take place. So in other words, I'll explain to you why some major historical developments that we might take for granted today would have been completely impossible without certain scientific inventions to facilitate them. At the end of the lecture, I'll reiterate my argument and leave you with a few words of advice. So let's get into the first theoretical part, which will establish a link between the social world and the scientific world. Now, the idea of science is often associated with progress. But as you'll see later in our talk, progress is a vague concept, and this makes it a contentious starting point. So I'll get back to the idea of progress later. This means that here we need a starting point that there is broader consensus on. And there are, at least to my mind, two ideas that can serve this purpose. The first idea is change as a value-neutral preposition. In other words, this refers not to any preset form or direction of change, but just to the idea that our knowledge of things today can be fundamentally different from what it was yesterday. And the second idea is that we constantly seek to find some form of new knowledge in some way. At different times in history, this could have been through collecting more data and conducting more experiments, or by making more analysis and using pure logic, depending on which era one might have lived in. So overall, this means that our starting point boils down to change and to the expansion of knowledge. In the past 500 years, however, there have been various interpretations of the direction that change has taken. Some thinkers, such as Francis Bacon, popularized the quote-unquote scientific method, meaning they promoted the idea that we base the laws of science on gathering and analyzing data from experiments and observations, and not through simply using logic-based arguments. Now, this was not always the case. If you explore what happened to those who had scientific ideas around the same time as Bacon did. So, until the 16th, 17th century, for example, the dominant astronomical theory in vast parts of the world was the geocentric model, which described the universe with the Earth at its center. When Copernicus proposed the heliocentric model with the sun at its center, this was met with opposition by the church. So many who followed and taught the Copernican model were burned at the stake, such as the Italian monk Giordano Bruno. From a scientific perspective, Copernicus's findings were a quote-unquote revolution, in the sense that they inspired many later scholars to take a new, non-mainstream direction, and this includes, for example, Galileo. From a social perspective, however, this was the beginning of an evolution instead. And by this, I mean gradual change in social structures. it's safe to say that without the scientific revolution, perhaps the fate of the church as a source of authority could have been very different today. And perhaps even the institution that you're studying at, which is one of the STEM departments at Queen Mary, might not have been here, or at least not in its current form. So at this point, what I'm starting to draw is a connection between the development, or rather the changes in the fundamental ideas that shape natural science and the effect that they can have in terms of steering major trends in the social world. In this line of thought, it's appropriate to ask, how did these fundamental changes in scientific thought occur? There are many scholars who have asked this question and provided extremely insightful answers, but there is no consensus on the topic. Still, one of the most influential contributions to the debate was made by Thomas Kuhn. And it is difficult to talk about Kuhn without referring to Popper, Lakatos, Feyerabend, and even Foucault. All of these scholars can be classified as philosophers of science. The first one to put forth his ideas was Karl Popper. And the key word associated with him is falsification, meaning seeking to prove certain ideas wrong. In essence, Popper thought that good scientists are critical thinkers who always seek to find whether they can falsify their ideas, while other pseudoscientists sought simply to protect their ideas. But if you think about it, it's not that hard to question whether all scientists indeed seek to really find ways to disprove their theories for the sake of what we call progress. Unsurprisingly, many scholars disagreed with Popper, and one of them was Kuhn, who thought that most of the time science isn't very critical at all. Instead, he thought it's only at specific and exceptional moments in history that science becomes critical. To understand why this is, you need to look at Kuhn's model of scientific development, which includes 4 phases. But before I show you the model, there is one important term that we need to define, called paradigm. So Kuhn defines a scientific paradigm as, quote, universally recognized scientific achievements that, for a time, provide model problems and solutions for a community of practitioners, end of quote. In other words, the term paradigm refers to a common set of understandings that everyone in a certain field agrees on. So with that in mind, let's now look at Kuhn's model, which has 4 phases. Now, I need to caution you that what I'm about to show you is a simplified version of Kuhn's model. So if you want to get more details on his thought, or to check what other phases he described in his model, please have a look at his work firsthand. Now, with that in mind, let's look at my simplification of Kuhn's model. So there is first the pre-paradigmatic phase, which is quite straightforward. It occurs only once, and this is the time period before we have a paradigm. In terms of examples, you could think about Western alchemists. Before we had shared assumptions about chemistry and physics, alchemists would try different methods to, for example, turn various metals into gold, or to look for ways of eternal life. Now, this type of phase of science isn't very productive, because when scientists can't work together, they can't build on each other's results, which means that everyone is constantly starting from scratch. Now, at some point, however, we see certain experiments or theories becoming more successful than others. And when we reach a moment like this, we see a paradigm being formed. So this is when scientists begin to agree on a common set of assumptions. When this happens, science enters a second phase called normal science. This is the time period when there is an accepted paradigm among most scholars within a field. Now, Kuhn believes that during this period, scientists not only take many things for granted, but don't even want to be critical about their shared assumptions. So, imagine telling a biologist that you have a theory that DNA is not a carrier of genetic information, or you have a theory that the microscope is not a useful tool. Well, of course, the biologist would either laugh at you or ignore you. Now, Kuhn believes that this is a good thing, because the fact that we have shared assumptions means that we can focus on more detailed work. And when the detailed work of many scientists piles up, we gather new knowledge. But that doesn't continue forever, because occasionally we enter a third phase called crisis. So here is why that happens. At any given point in time, the dominant paradigm cannot answer all of the questions that scientists might have. So during the normal phase, that might be okay, because the unanswered questions or anomalies are usually the minority, the smaller part of questions that we might have. And also because scientists generally believe that these unanswered questions will be resolved in the future. However, over time they pile up, and we might reach a point where we have too many unanswered questions, or perhaps start to make too many observations that are not explained by the science of the day. This is when we start to doubt what we previously believed during the quote-unquote normal science period. So there are two ways to end a crisis. One is using the old paradigm to address the new anomalies that emerge. If this happens, then confidence in the old paradigm will be restored. But if this doesn't happen, we'll need a new paradigm to emerge. In this case, we'll enter the fourth phase of the model, a paradigm shift, or in other words, a scientific revolution of sorts. This would mean abandoning completely the old way of looking at the world and creating a new one. So for instance, the Darwinian revolution in biology was an example of this. Before Darwin, one of the dominant theories was what we call today orthogenesis. And this suggested that evolution was happening, but in a particular direction and for a particular greater purpose driven by a higher force. Now, this theory is, of course, largely obsolete today, but it has a long history, dating at least to the medieval period, according to some, and according to others, even being rooted in Aristotelian biology. So, when Darwinian theory came about, this didn't mean that a sudden revolution took place within a day or a week. Instead, there was a gradual process during which less and less scientists believed in orthogenesis, and more scientists would embrace the natural selection principle. Now, this is an example of a paradigm shift, where one way of thinking is abandoned and another entirely new way of thinking is accepted. When this happens, we enter the normal science phase again, and this becomes a perpetual cycle. One important side note here is that, according to Kuhn, rival paradigms are incommensurable, which means that he thinks there is no neutral or objective way to say which one is better, and the only observation we can be sure about is that they shift over time. Of course, this is a contested idea, which presumably a lot of you as STEM students might disagree with. But of course, it's impossible to prove either side of the argument. Now, in addition to Popper and Kuhn, there are, of course, other philosophers of science who have also contributed to understanding its development and major shifts. So, I'll mention some of them briefly. Lakatos was a student of Popper, but his views stood somewhere in between those of Popper and Kuhn. So he thought that the two viewpoints can be reconciled, and that although there are paradigm shifts and scientists might not always be critical, we can seek to evaluate whether these paradigm shifts are progressing or backtracking. The way to do this, Lakatos thought, was to evaluate whether new paradigms do better at, for example, predicting new facts. Another important philosopher here is Foucault, who used the term episteme to describe the condition of a particular epoch or era of science. He thought that subconsciousness is what prevents scientists from being critical most of the time. For him, the issue is that they simply never think of truly novel questions to ask. So, for instance, a medieval scholar of animals and plants in Western Europe might have been educated in the Christian tradition and never assumed that there is a natural selection process unrelated to a greater power. But of course, in any society, there are many systems of power and dominant forms of knowledge that act around us and might implicitly limit the types of questions we ask, or even the type of language, the type of vocabulary we use. And we're all victims of all of this subconsciously. Now, one more important philosopher here is Feyerabend, who had a different view. And he was perhaps one of the most radical philosophers of the 20th century. Among many other works, he wrote an influential book called Against Method. And it suggests the idea of epistemological anarchism. So he sought to question every hypothesis or claim that was ever made within science. what he aimed to do was to ultimately undermine the privileged position of science within society. And although he clearly didn't succeed completely, his impact was still enormous. So overall, you can see that there is a spectrum of thought when it comes to the relationship between society, subjectivity, and science, or at least the way that we understand science. But this relationship also works the other way around. And in the second half of my talk, I'll argue that it does so in ways that are at least equally powerful. So in the next section of the talk, I'll aim to show you how and why scientific inventions lead to social changes, or at least determine the possible spectrum of outcomes in terms of changes in social structure. I'll start by taking a step back and drawing a distinction between humans and other species. Now, one of the characteristics that makes us as humans distinctive is our complex material culture. And what I mean by this here is two things. First, the fact that we create and use complex tools is remarkable in itself. And this has to do both with our cognitive and physical endowments. In other words, we have both the ability to come up with new ideas for new tools, and the physical ability to create and use them with our hands and our thumbs in particular. Let me just flip back to the previous slide here. So there is one more point here, and it has to do with our ability to develop emotional connections to objects. So this goes beyond, for example, let's say a child that likes a toy. So what I mean here is that we ascribe emotional meanings to things like paintings or buildings. So a chimpanzee might play around with the Mona Lisa, but most likely wouldn't put it in a protected area and ponder about the way that it has impacted the history of art. So, in fact, the human trait of drawing emotional connections to objects also drives the way that much of, for example, modern marketing is made. As I'm sure you all know, when you purchase a MacBook or a Starbucks cup of coffee, you're not just buying a product, but instead a sense of lifestyle, an experience, even a chunk of psychological comfort. And all of this has to do with basic human patterns of thought. So, in this sense, our material culture is not purely about gaining immediate benefit or gratification, but also has a cognitive aspect. Now, what's interesting is also that our own physical evolution can drive changes in the way that we build material culture. And then these material changes bring about more changes, but this time in our social structure. So, at this point, my argument might seem quite abstract to you, so I'll turn to a few specific examples to illustrate it. So let's take, for instance, the hand axe. Now, from our perspective today, it might seem like a rather primitive object, but historically, it seems to have been a revolutionary one when it was invented. perhaps by the early Neanderthals. So the hand axe is a difficult object to reverse engineer. So this means that some people would have to teach others how to make it. But this process requires a certain level of biological, or you could also say, I guess, material or physical evolution. This requires, for instance, joint attention for an extended period of time between expert, apprentice, and object. And this is a characteristic that you can observe among humans, but not among, for example, chimpanzees. So what I'm saying here is that physical evolution changed the way that we invent material objects to begin with. But then these new objects, and in this case the hand axe, seem to also influence back social structure. Now, the early Neanderthals could use the hand axe to change patterns of collecting large quantities of natural resources. And when you do that, society can adjust, and this can contribute to, for example, deepening division of labor, or living a more localized lifestyle and moving around a little less, because presumably you'd want to store your new resources in one place and live nearby so you can access them in the future. And the Neanderthals were, to put it simply, the original cavemen. So it is easy to see how their lifestyle linked to the use of certain tools like the hand axe. So in this sense, you can see how physical evolution improved our ability to make material progress, and how the new inventions we created shaped changes in social structures. Now, some of you might think that the axe is a dated example, but there are plenty of much more recent inventions that shaped or reshaped human history. If you look around, you'll discover that the room you're in most likely has plenty of objects that are commonly used and that you might regard as unremarkable, but in fact shaped social structures in very significant ways. So one such device is the clock. Until the 14th, 15th century, people would measure time in ways that were not precise. So they had, for example, candle clocks, sundials, astronomical clocks, all kinds of other clocks. But you wouldn't always use these to tell the exact time of the day, and of course you couldn't carry one everywhere you went, because frankly nobody was concerned about the exact time of the day. And there was no need to be, because time was thought of differently. It was thought of as something much less specific than it is today. And then later, when the mechanical clock was invented, this enabled a shift in world history that continues until today and shapes all of our lives, quite literally all the time. In sociology and anthropology, this is called time discipline, and it is the name we give to social and economic rules, conventions, customs, and expectations governing the measurement of time, the social currency and the awareness of time measurements, and people's expectations concerning the observance of these customs by others. Now, this concept was pioneered about 50 years ago by E.P. Thompson, who wrote about time, work discipline, and industrial capitalism from a Marxist perspective. But you don't need to be a Marxist or a critic of capitalism to see how the clock changed our lives. If you think about your own weekly schedule, your classes at university, or any other events that you have set for the day, then the impact of the clock will become self-evident. Now, another scientific invention that changed the world was Gutenberg's printing press, and it was invented in the 15th century. Now, of course, there were various ways of printing before that, and some of them were developed in East Asia, where you had notably woodblock printing invented in China, later developed also in Japan. But the efficiency of the printing press was just unparalleled. Now, Gutenberg himself was born in Mainz, which is today in Western Germany. During medieval times, Mainz used to be a very rich city, but then the plague hit it a couple of times and the economy suffered a lot. So by the 15th century, Mainz was a city that was politically still very important, but on the decline in general. So Gutenberg decided to move, and he went to Strasbourg, which is today in France. When he arrived there in the 1430s, the city was a huge economic center, and there were two main markets for Gutenberg's press. One was the established and powerful church, and the other one was the then emerging market of universities, which were only beginning to develop at the time. When it came to the church, you've probably heard this before, but Bibles were very rare and very expensive back then. It was unthinkable for ordinary people to own a Bible or any sort of important book, really. Now, this was, of course, because books were handwritten by scribes who would have to sit in the same position all day, copying the text. And it was like having very slow human printers. But once the printing press was invented and Gutenberg took it to the market, this became, of course, revolutionary in terms of technology, and a lot of engineering effort went into improving the printing press, both while Gutenberg was alive and after his death. In fact, we don't even know what exactly the first printing press looked like. Although there are experts who have been trying and we think able to reconstruct it, like Alan May. Now, if you observe historical shifts in the long term, you'll discover that the printing press had a remarkable effect. When it went into use, the main market Gutenberg targeted was institutions of religion, and universities were a secondary market. Today, universities are a major market, and religious institutions are not as powerful, at least in relative terms. So, it is very difficult to see how that could have happened without the printing press and without mass education in natural science, which came, of course, through printed books. Now, another even more common effect of the printing press was the rise of global literacy and the changes it brought to the way we use language on a daily basis. If there were no printed books at the mass level, it's unlikely that all of us would have been literate today. There are also various changes in terms of techniques for consolidating power that came with the printing press. the church might have ultimately faded, but the desire of various governments and other institutions to promote their own ideas at the mass level seems to have increased considerably. So whether you look at the relative importance of institutions and how it changes, or at things such as increases in literacy levels, you have to consider the way in which the printing press enabled these changes, even as a possibility to begin with. Now, reading books, of course, also became a common way of communicating beyond the natural limitations of time and space. And there are also many other inventions that changed our perception of time and space over the years. So, for instance, the discoveries of all sorts of new medicine or of healthier ways of life, or the decrease in the amount of manual labor that we need to do within our lifetime. All of these changes are rooted in scientific discoveries or inventions and led to a dramatic increase in life expectancy. We literally live longer than people before us. And of course, this changes our perception of time. In terms of transport, starting from the wheel and going all the way to modern inventions such as the airplane or the automobile, transport-related inventions change the way we navigate through time and space. So, all of these developments and the social role that they play involve multiple aspects that determine the opportunities and challenges that emerge throughout history and that we continue to encounter today. Now, a particularly fascinating strand of inventions that I want to focus briefly on revolves around the idea of new ways for communication and around new media. Like most modern inventions, the radio was the result of an accumulation of technological development. And in various forms, it appeared during the first half of the 20th century and had a tremendous impact on society. In its early days, radio signal was used to communicate during wars. So, on the field, of course, this meant adjusting military strategy as you receive new information. The US Army famously invested heavily into radio communication. At the same time, radio emissions were transmitted by state authorities to the masses within countries, and that would mobilize a lot of people. And later, after the war, when radio became more popular as an everyday entertainment medium, it transformed entire industries, like the music industry. 200 or so years ago, the role that music played in society was very different from the role that it has today. Music was usually either more traditional, as in perhaps old popular songs with simple melodies, or more elitist, as in perhaps classical music. So there was much less middle ground, much less music that would fall within the category of what we call popular music and what we listen to most of the time today. Recently, we've seen a big surge in demand for streaming online podcasts, but this also started with the art of the radio. In a way, when it was invented, the radio was almost like Gutenberg's printing press. Up until that point, books could only travel so far and so fast. And suddenly you had the ability to transmit voice all across the world. And this changed things on a massive scale. So suddenly you had the technological means, the material capability of speaking at one end of the world and being heard at another. Now, the next revolution in communications came with television. And this led to other social changes. So, what's popular on the radio isn't necessarily what would be popular on TV. Perhaps even the current US president is a product of this evolution in communication from radio to television. If you look at analysis of Donald Trump's speech, you'll see that he uses phrases and vocabulary at a 4th or 5th grade level. And that's much lower than the level of vocabulary that other previous US presidents have used throughout the decades. President Trump also speaks in sentences that are often, from a linguistic perspective, incomplete or simply broken language. So imagine if you put his voice on the radio. It's almost impossible to see how he could have become so famous to begin with. But of course, he became a reality TV star because he uses a lot of visuals in terms of communication as well. A boardroom, body language, eye contact, things that are not necessarily transmitted via radio. So, in a sense, you could say that scientific inventions enabled the possibility of someone like Donald Trump, who has very good nonverbal communication skills, to be elected in the first place. Now, more recently, of course, we've all been a part of the rise of social media as well. And this was also a part of the last US election, but I won't get into that here. Now, before Facebook and Twitter existed, we had the idea of 6 degrees of separation, popularized by the film and the play of the same title. So there was the notion that we're never further away than 6 connections from any other person in the world. But still, we had a certain small personal network that was limited by our constraints in terms of time and space. Even if you would perhaps write letters to your friends in other places, of course you wouldn't be able to reach them at the other end of the world on a daily basis until the first telephone, and then social media came about. Now, you can of course connect with people who you don't even know personally today, and then you could chat with them. This 6 degrees of separation theory was actually tested through research from Facebook and Twitter. And when the results came in, it turned out that on Facebook, you're only 4.74 chains away from the most distant person on the platform. So that means 4 or 5 degrees of separation for most people. The numbers for Twitter were even lower. And they showed that even the most distant people on the platform were between about 3.4 and 4.6 or 4.7 chains away. So, how does this change social structures? Well, apart from what you see in daily life, For example, perhaps meeting someone with common interests on social media. I would argue that this could also have a profound effect on human evolution if it continues. For thousands of years, our entire species has evolved to keep only a limited number of people in each person's close network. And that's at least partly because your network is made up of people that you need to spend resources like time and effort on in order to keep in touch with. Before, that used to mean perhaps finding time to catch up with them, to meet up with them, or things like remembering their birthday. But today, Facebook and all the other social media tell you when their birthday is, or when they have a new job, or when they got engaged. What this means is that you don't have to do as much to keep your connection with them. You just click a button or you type one sentence and you're done. Now you've reminded them of you. It's also easier to meet with others because you can do video calls and catch up with them. So this basically means that we can now maintain a larger network with the same type of effort. And if things stay like that, thousands of years from now, we might even evolve differently in terms of our brain structure, or at least in terms of our social norms and structures. So, in a nutshell, all of these scientific inventions lead to changes in our social structures. Now, at the global level, I would even go a step further and argue that the entire international system and the way that states choose to engage or not to engage with each other is also largely shaped by material development in terms of scientific inventions. From the perspective of large-scale interstate war, we live in relatively peaceful times. There are, of course, various forms of conflict around the globe, but there hasn't been a Third World War for over 70 years now. Well, in international relations, one of the main hypotheses for this is the idea of nuclear peace. And that's the idea that under some circumstances, nuclear weapons can induce stability and decrease the chances of crisis escalation. Those who believe in nuclear peace argue that controlled nuclear proliferation can lead to global stability in terms of the international system. Now, personally, you might not like this idea, or you might have a more nuanced view, but it's a fact that nuclear powers today would not attack other nuclear powers, at least partially because of the possibility of bilateral annihilation if they do that. So, in this sense, scientific inventions can have a prohibitive function. But in any case, they provide a serious incentive for taking a particular type of action or inaction. And in this way, I view them as some sort of a big part of the root causes or shifts, or sometimes even lack of shifts in world history. Of course, I'm far from being the first to suggest that material development shapes or at least impacts considerably the course of development that history takes. On a more micro level, Karl Marx, of course, has argued that material conditions determine one's mindset and worldview. But my argument here is profoundly different. And it is also at a much more macro level. So it would be important to also look at other similar theories that propose ideas which relate to mine. Now, there are some examples that I'll mention here, starting with Stephen Sanderson's quote-unquote evolutionary materialism. He sees this as a theoretical strategy and claims that it can explain all important evolutionary events revealed by world history. These events include, for example, the origin of agriculture 10,000 years ago, the transition to civilization 5,000 years ago, the dynamics of agrarian civilization, the birth of capitalism in Europe, and the modern world system, as well as its institutions. Now, Sanderson sees 4 types of material conditions: demographic, ecological, technological, and economic. So it's a macro theory, and there are many debates about it, but it's an insightful way of viewing world history. Of course, you also have archaeologists whose entire discipline reconstructs portions of history through analyzing material remains that we can find. And there are many works by archaeologists which are well written on topics such as the links between society, evolution, and material culture. Now, when we talk about scientific inventions and social evolution, there is also another prominent and very recent theory that deserves to be mentioned. And it contains the idea of singularity. The basic premise here is Moore's law, which tells us that the computational capability of new technology that we invent increases exponentially, and it's really difficult to disagree with this statement when you look at how this develops over time. Now, when singularity becomes more controversial is in its prediction for the future, because it suggests that humanity as a whole might one day be governed by a collective body or a brain of some sort, most likely artificial intelligence. But in any case, even if you disagree with this proposition, it is important to keep it in mind as one of the influential theories out there. Now, in contrast to these theories, my argument today has been quite different. So let me move on to my conclusion. To put it concisely, what I argued in the main part of my talk was that technological innovation delimits the possibilities that the evolution of social structures can take. And in this sense, developments in natural sciences are driving forces of the social world in world history. Before technology and before we had tools, the possibilities for change in front of us were much different. And we were a lot more strictly bound by the limits of nature. Now, during the talk today, We established first that there is a strong link between natural sciences and social sciences through exploring philosophy of science. And we also demonstrated that assumptions matter, and they might sometimes be subjective and even change over time. Then, with all of the inventions that we mentioned during the talk, including the hand axe, the clock, the printing press, transport vehicles, radio, social media, and nuclear weapons, we showed that they provide certain incentives for the development of world history in very particular directions. So, in this sense, one of the most important takeaways from my talk is to think about the ways in which each new scientific invention reshapes time and space and impacts the development of structures within our social world. To conclude my talk, I'd like to leave you with one final thought to consider. When we think of changing the world, of gathering the power to do something meaningful, some of us might instinctively first focus on the social world. When many people are asked to think about ways to change the world, some of the answers inevitably include things like becoming a politician, or starting a company, or launching an NGO. But when you look closely at history and social evolution through changes in social structures, you might just realize that a lot of the decisions that are made by people in power are actually the result of limited options defined by the material conditions of the time. And these material conditions, of course, can be changed through the creation or distribution of scientific inventions. As STEM students, this means that you, and I mean each of you, could have a vital role to play in the formation of world history, because you have the power to invent or reinvent technology, or perhaps even change the dominant paradigms in your fields. You are, in a sense, quite literally, a part of the forces that drive world history. I hope that you can keep this in mind as you progress through your studies in your careers in natural science, and that your work joins that of many scientists who shaped world history as we know it. Thank you very much for listening, and stay safe for the remaining months of the COVID-19 pandemic.